indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, item 2 on the agenda is roll call.
Commissioner Donaldson?
Here.
Commissioner Kent?
Here.
Chair Waddy?
Here. Great. Moving on to item 3 on our agenda, ex parte communications. Are there any ex parte communications with any members of the commission?
Nope, not me.
None with me? Great. That will move us on to item 4 on the agenda. Item 4 is the consent calendar. For members of the public, the consent calendar items are considered to be routine and will be enacted on by one motion. By approval of the consent calendar, the staff recommendations will be adopted unless otherwise modified by the commission. There will be no separate discussion on these items unless a member of the commission or a member of the audience requests removal of one of the items on the consent calendar. Tonight we have 3 items on the consent calendar. Item 4-1, Planning and Zoning Commission meeting minutes from June 12th. Item 4-2, Planning Application 19-032, Design Review for a Single-Story Rear Addition at 827 Key Route. And item 4-3, Planning Application 19-034, Design Review and Conditional Use Permit Amendment for 904 Masonic. Do we have any members of the public who wish to pull any of those items off consent? Okay, which item? Last item, so we've got a request from the public to pull 904 Masonic off the consent calendar. Any others from commissioners?
No.
Want to make a motion to?
Actually, I missed the meeting on the 12th, so I'd have to abstain from approving the minutes.
A motion to approve the minutes from June 10th, 12th, thank you.
Should we take those as 2 separate motions then? Okay. I'll second the motion to approve the minutes. I guess it's just us. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'll abstain.
Great. And on item 4-2, the single-story addition at 827 Key Route, Commissioner Donaldson?
No, I have no, I'm not going to pull that.
Okay.
I'm okay.
We have a motion. We had a motion on that?
Sure. So, 904 Masonic has been pulled. So I will move approval of the rest of the consent calendar, which includes the single-story rear addition at 827 Key Route.
I'll second that. Okay, roll call vote. Commissioner Donaldson?
I say aye.
Commissioner Kent?
Aye.
Commissioner Jennings?
Yeah, sorry, did you already approve the minutes?
We did.
Okay, there was an error that I wanted to point out. I'm sorry that I'm late. My car was dead. But sorry, if I could just tell you what it is, and maybe we can just make sure it's corrected in the final, because they called you me in one place. Sorry, guys. So this was on the, it was just before item 7.1, new business. Said that Chair Jennings noted the Redfin listing. It should say Chair Waddy. That's all I wanted to mention. So if we could, hopefully we can just slide that in to the minutes. And otherwise, I vote to approve the rest of the consent calendar. Thank you.
So why don't we go ahead and make that as an amendment to the motion for the draft minutes? And we call for the vote on 4-2?
We almost did, and then you asked for a recall on the.
Got it. Why don't we call item 4-2 once again? So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Seeing none, that item has been approved.
Okay.
So with that, items 4-1, the meeting minutes as amended, and items 4-2 for 827 Key Route have been approved. Just a note for 827 Key Route, there is a 14-day appeal period, so please be cognizant of that. With that, we'll move to item 4-3 that was pulled off the consent calendar, design review and conditional use for 904 Masonic. Do we want to have a staff presentation, brief one?
Sure, we can do a quick presentation. Once again, this is PA 19-034 for design review and conditional use amendment, permit amendment for a new mixed-use residential building at 904 Masonic Avenue. The applicant is seeking design review and conditional use permit to approval to amend a previously approved new mixed residential building at 904 Masonic, which was filed under application 18-090. The subject site is a 3,751 square foot lot with an existing 980 square foot single-story structure built in 1924. The applicant is proposing to amend the previously approved project proposal to include one additional dwelling unit within the approved building envelope. Each residential unit is proposed to be 752 square feet and have 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. The building is proposed to be contemporary in design with a maximum height of 35 feet. This would result in a new mixed-use residential building with a commercial ground floor and a total of 4 identical residential units. 3 off-street parking spaces are provided at the rear, and a conditional use permit is required to waive the 4th required off-street parking space.
And just one other thing to note, you received correspondence earlier today from a neighbor regarding this project.
Okay. With that, why don't we give the project, is the project sponsor here? If you want to have a few minutes to speak before we open it up for public comment, or not, it's your opportunity to speak, though, if you'd like to.
Is it possible that I can just respond to whatever the issues are?
Sure, we can go ahead. Sure, we can go ahead and open it up for public comment first. Gentleman in the back who wanted to pull this off consent, if you'd like to come up to the podium, you've got 3 minutes to provide your comments.
Well, thank you. I'm Richard Pipkin. I spoke to the commission briefly in February when this project was last up, and basically mentioned our concerns as a neighborhood about the building at the time was going to be 3 units with 3 parking lots, but there was a clear intention at the time to make it 4 units with 3 parking lots. And at the time, the commission said, well, basically, we can't take any action on the parking concern at that time. So I'm back here once again to ask you to reconsider, or actually reconsider or consider for the first time that the conditional use permit for the waiver of the parking provides no benefit to the community, creates an adverse impact upon the neighborhood, and really shouldn't be approved. There is an approved project. Let's go ahead and let the approved project proceed. Or if it's not okay with the project sponsor, he can adjust it, and we can talk about it some more later. On a basic level, I know that some people may look at Masonic Avenue and see one side of the street without any houses on it and think that there's plenty of parking. What's the issue? As somebody who's lived there for 13 years, I can tell you that when I come home in the evening, if it wasn't for my driveway, most times there wouldn't be a parking spot for me. Also, a few years ago, the city did a project that removed 6 or 7 parking spots directly in front of the subject property. There is nothing but a red curb in front of this property. So any extra cars, like from a 4th unit, will mean that those cars are also on the street. And let's not forget, of course, there will be additional parking from whatever is in that commercial space that's on the 1st floor. So there appears to be quite a bit of adverse impact upon the immediate neighborhood area, and I'm not really seeing a good reason for converting this from a 3-unit to a 4-unit project, other than maybe to maximize the profit. I don't know. I don't know the reasons. I shouldn't speculate. I apologize for that. And lastly, I would say from the standpoint of diversity, the project is pretty diverse right now. It's providing a 4-bedroom unit and 2 2-bedroom units and a commercial space as well. So the current proposal would actually just diminish the housing diversity that the project is proposing to provide for the community. So maybe we should just keep it the way it is. Thank you.
Is there any additional public comment? Please come on up to the podium and state your name. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is David Kennard. I reside at 906 Masonic, so I'll be a neighbor of the project. I too can share the concerns about the parking. For example, this morning, there was a car parked in the red zone in front of the vacant house at 904. There was a car parked in the spot in front of my house, which is the normal zone. And then there was another car parked in blocking my driveway, which limited my access of getting out for 45 minutes. The parking on the other side of the street was completely full. There was some event going on. I don't know what it was. I think that having the additional unit, one would like to think that having a multi-unit structure close to Solano would not require a lot of additional parking because people could walk everywhere. But we all know that there will be a fourth car that needs to be parked someplace. It'll be on the street. Parking is already tight. I think there needs to be something done. And also maybe better enforcement of the parking rules so that people don't habitually park in the red spot in front of that place and don't block people's driveways. So I share Rick's concern about the impact on the parking in that neighborhood, that part of the neighborhood. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers for this item? Seeing none, public comment is closed. We can turn it back to the project sponsor to respond.
My name is Richard Tapp. I'm the architect for the project. Adam Nasser is unavailable today to come. He's the owner of the property. So as far as originally we submitted for, the design was for 4 units and with 1 commercial and exactly the same building envelope as we have here. And when we submitted, we ended up, there was a zoning conflict, and so therefore we applied for 3 units, which was allowed under, I think, a 1970 footnote on a zoning code that no one really knew about except a gentleman that pointed it out to the staff. So what we did is we got approval for the 3 units and we converted the top floor, the 3rd floor, into 1 large 4-bedroom unit. So the intent all along was to to provide for 4 units. We looked at the parking. Originally, we were looking at doing a bike parking substitution for 1 parking space. What we have to do is you're allowed, with the Planning Commission's approval, if you provide 10 bike parking spaces, that will substitute for 1 car parking space. However, in addition, you need one bike space for every unit, and you also need 1 bike space for a commercial unit. So that ended up being 15 bike spaces, and we didn't have enough room for that. The other thing, too, is we thought that was fairly excessive, that having 15 bike spaces there would probably not be used. So what we decided to do was we went and looked at the parking. The times that I've been there has been parking on the other side of Masonic, and I'm sure there are times when there may not be if there's an event on or whatever. And I'm not sure about the parking rules for residents, but people park there, I think, for transit and for also biking on the bike path, etc. So what we did is we looked at AC Transit on Solano Avenue, the amenities on Solano. We looked at the proximity to BART, and then we also we looked at the parking on the around the neighbourhood, and then we decided that we would request a parking reduction of 1 space. And we also, in addition, provided 4 additional bike spaces. So we have a total of 8 bike spaces plus 1 for the commercial, so we have 9 instead of the 15. Now, we've also, my client has also agreed to unbundle the parking. So therefore, tenants who come to the building and are applying do not actually have to take that do not have to take a parking space as part of the rent, and the rent would be less for that if they didn't want the parking space. So, and the other thing is many of my friends, many of my children's younger friends don't have cars, and this is in Berkeley as well as San Francisco, and they bike and they catch Uber or Lyft. I'm not sure I agree with that, but still, the biking I agree with, but Uber and Lyft I'm not sure about. But it's something where there's no guarantee that you will have an extra, one of the tenants may not have a parking space requirement. So that's the position that we've come back to the Commission on. We've converted the third floor into 2 units. It doesn't make sense financially or even from a marketability point of view to have a very large 4-bedroom unit up there. The type of tenants that we would get would not really be large families. It'd probably be, younger college students or whatever to use the 4 bedrooms. So it makes much more sense having 2 units up there, 2 2-bedroom units. And I think it's very reasonable for requesting a parking reduction. Staff has also reviewed it and supporting the application. And I think this is, I think, the 3rd Planning Commission hearing we've been to, and the commissioners have been very supportive of the project and the design. And I would hope you would approve it this evening. We've already been delayed like 3-4 months because of the zoning conflict originally. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. All right, with that, we'll turn it back to the Commission.
Okay.
Any thoughts? Anyone want to start?
Well, I know that when the project was originally presented to us, you did hear support for it being 4 units. And, I personally, I know we had to deal with that. It wasn't, the conflict that you were referring to was this footnote in the zoning code that said you had to have a minimum square footage of lot area per unit. And so it was kind of an additional artificial constraint on density that we felt was outdated and didn't advance the goals of the zoning code. So we did get rid of that and the city council approved. But at that time, I know I was a little disappointed to see it shrink to 3 units rather than 4. And I continue to be supportive of it being 4 units. I do think we need all the units that we can get, and I think that overall it is advancing the diversity of housing types in Albany. I also think that there's, based on the 3 meetings we've had on this project and the discussion that we've had around the parking issues, while, I don't discount that, there may at times be constrained parking on Masonic, I think that the applicant has demonstrated that, they've done the work and thought smartly about the project, and that this is the kind of project that's consistent with our goals of increasing the housing stock and occasionally granting exceptions for the number of parking spaces. So without necessarily rehashing everything that we've been over at the last couple of meetings, I do continue to support it. And with respect to the spaces that the city removed from being available for parking, I don't totally understand what the situation was there. And, if there is some potential for neighbors to, perhaps discuss with other city staff whether it's possible to reopen some of that, then that's great. It's not within our purview, and I also don't think it's not really on the new applicant to solve all of the existing problems that may exist.
And just to add to that, there is a separate process proceeding with the Traffic and Safety Commission and our city's transportation planner on some bigger refinements to that intersection, including new signals and armheads and so on and so forth. So there's a much broader scope that is on the front burner.
That's currently under discussion. And
I think I'm not sure that it's going to Traffic and Safety this month, but I think it's going in July.
Okay. So changes may be coming to the intersection.
There are indeed changes that are anticipated.
Okay. Yeah.
Commissioner Donaldson?
All right, I'll make comments. I'm trying to formulate my thoughts in my head here. Essentially, I do support the project. I voted for it earlier, and I really like the project, and I think it's more appropriate as a 4-unit project than as a 3-unit project from a design and marketing and planning kind of point of view. I'm really glad that you've come forward, the neighbors have, with your comments and concerns about the parking. I can support 1 unit with no parking spaces for basically 2 reasons. One is because there is the other side of the street that has no homes along it, and because the project is right next to a transit stop. Both of those reasons sort of require a leap of faith on my part and the part of all of us. And what's going on and been happening in recent planning developments and in recent planning theory and urban planning theory is that there seems to be a tacit assumption that the demand for cars should drop or is dropping or can be forced to drop by reducing parking. So we're all reducing parking. We've reduced the parking requirements throughout Albany in the single-family zone a couple of years ago. We've approved projects on Solano, other projects on Solano with no parking. I can think of one anyway. It's going on all over. BART is developing projects at Del Norte with very little parking because the idea is that all of those people are going to be taking transit. Personally, I hope they're right. And if they're not, we're going to have a big parking problem in 10 or 15 years. And I don't know. To me, the jury is still out on that. I see what's happening with traffic with Uber and Lyft, which is sort of a new thing, and it's totally changed the way a lot of people travel. And the result is that we're seeing increases in traffic congestion on a lot of our streets. Self-driving cars are coming. We've had comments when we did the general plan about, well, where are you going to park all those self-driving cars? And that's a legitimate question. I don't know how that technology is going to change. Complete streets, we've looked at parking, and with the alternative that's being looked at as well, that would optimize more biking along Solano Avenue that could reduce some parking. That's a concern to me. And the Complete Streets project actually increased the parking through AC Transit's reduction of a couple of bus stops. So I think that parking is very much on the agenda, and that we as commissioners, this commission, needs to be reminded of that. If you hadn't have come tonight to speak, the project probably would have been approved on the consent calendar. So it is sort of up to the neighbors to remind us frequently that people do drive, that we do have cars, that a lot of people have cars, that I don't think car ownership is dropping, but I don't know. And it may happen. It may happen that way. My son, who lives in Berkeley, has a large family, only 1 car, and that's less than what we have and my wife and I have. So that may be the trend, and that may be what's happening. And I kind of hope that's true, and I hope that we don't have to allocate so much space in our urban environment to parking, to storing cars, ideally. But we're in a transition space here, and I don't know how it's going to play out in Albany. And right now, I'm willing to take the leap of faith that there will not be a slew of cars generated by this 4-unit development, and I support it. So I don't know. That's sort of my comments there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Commissioner Kent?
Not much to add to that other than, I think we're balancing halfway between an urban city and a suburban town, and we're feeling the growth pains of the density. We can't have business as usual with the amount of cars older generation assumes we'll need. We're a 1-car family. It took a little bit to get used to it, a couple years, but now works out pretty well. So that's all I'm going to say about the parking, but I did have a couple other comments on this plan now that's been brought up. And if we zoom in on the streetscape, it's just a minor adjustment. The tree well is, you got this new tree on there, but you have a puny little 3x3 tree well or something. And right there, if you zoom in, you see a little square around the tree. I'm not sure why you can't just open up that whole space between the sidewalk and the curb for a growing medium for that tree. Because you're taking out a really beautiful tree and you're sticking in a little tree in a concrete box. See the square there? I think it's 3x3 or something of that sort. So I know this is just schematic design, but as the plans get developed, it'd be great if you could widen that tree well. Additionally, on the side of the section or elevations from the street show a line of shrubs screening the driveway from the residence to the south. But that line of shrubs is actually on the other property. So I'm not sure why that's shown. It's not there currently. Now, this plan shows it properly, but the section shows it differently. Well, that's what I was wondering. If there was some agreement with that, or, I'm not sure. I mean, it might look nice. Yeah, it might look nice. Right now, it's just a strip of lawn. But, so those are just a couple adjustments.
So I don't have much to add, and I agree with Commissioner Jennings. I said a fair amount at the last two hearings in terms of my general support for the increased density and for the reduction in parking. As a general rule of thumb, I would rather us be focused on producing more housing, which then I think leads to our ability in Albany to have a much more dynamic and vibrant commercial corridor. The more people that we have here, the more people we have to serve our businesses. And I would really hate to see the increased density not be approved because of an infeasibility of adding additional parking. So to me, that's part of the sort of trade-off that I'm looking at here. And I completely agree that I think Albany is in this place where it's halfway between sort of a city and a suburban environment. And I think that's sort of the constant struggle. If we weren't trying to create sort of walkable, vibrant communities, we would have a ton of parking and have a lot more space. But we're not quite 100% there where everyone can incredibly rely on public transit for all aspects of their needs. So I get that there's this inherent tension. As somebody who lived in the city for about 15 years, and a good portion of that I didn't own a car, the few years I did, I was very used to parking blocks away from where I lived on the street. And so I guess for me, the idea of having to park a half block away or a block away isn't a very big deal. If I'm not circling for 15 minutes, I see that as kind of a victory. And I know that is a very different perspective that, if you don't have that experience, I know my folks are very used to being able to park right in front of their home in Albany, and they have for 40 some years, and they get really annoyed when they can't park in front of their house. So I get that it's just kind of a perspective of where you're coming from and what your experiences have been. But for me, I do think sort of on balance, there's sufficient parking within the general neighborhood for everyone to be able to accommodate their lives and taking care of business. And with that, I am supportive of adding the density without the parking. Does anyone want to make a motion on this?
No, I don't think so. With that, I'll move approval of planning application 19034 for 904 Masonic Avenue.
I'll second.
Great. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Seeing none in opposition, that item has been approved by a 4-0 vote. Just so the sponsor knows, there is a 14-day appeal period, so be cognizant of that. All right. With that, we are moving on the agenda to our regular calendar. Item 5 is general public comment. This is for persons desiring to address the commission on an item that is not otherwise agendized. Is there anyone who would like to speak on a non-agendized item? Seeing none, public comment is closed. That takes us to item 6 on the agenda, or item 6-1, planning application 19-036, design review for a 2-level addition at 1036 Ramona. And it looks like here this is review and comment?
Exactly.
Okay, great. So with that, we'll open it up for a presentation.
Once again, this is planning application 19036, design review for a two-story addition at 1036 Ramona. Some background on the property. The subject property is a 35-foot wide by 120-foot lot, or 4,200 square feet, with an existing 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom, 1,061 square foot house built in 1928. City records show minor work done to the property, in addition to a garage being built in 1929, a small addition off the rear in 1935. Apparently it was used as a hobby shop back in the day, and then also electrical service upgrade in 94. Here is a street view of the property as it sits today. And the project request, the applicant is seeking design review for a 1,199 square foot second-story addition to the home. The project scope includes entire interior reprogramming and remodeling. With that would come a first floor with a kitchen, breakfast area, dining room, a half bath, and a living room. The second floor is proposed to accommodate 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a laundry area. Altogether, the project scope would result in a 4-bedroom, 3.5 bathroom, 2,150 square foot home with a maximum height of 2610. Here's an existing elevation of the home as it sits today. And here's the proposed front elevation. Notice the bay window details carried over to the second floor and a new front porch at the on the right-hand side of the home. Here's the proposed south elevation, the proposed north, and the proposed west or rear elevation with a rear porch and a mimicked bay window detail at the second story. Exceptional design. Projects which exceed a 0.45 FAR are subject to exceptional design as reviewed by the Planning and Zoning Commission. These exceptional design treatments include horizontal cement siding with wood textures on the exterior of the home, attic vent detailing mimicked across the gable ends of the roof forms, bay windows at the front and rear of the second story addition, front and rear porches, solar panels and skylights are proposed on the roof as well, and the applicant has proposed matching cross gable roof forms. Some possible project refinement as the plans are presented to you before you today. There are some refinement that could be taken into consideration. One is to consider reducing the number of gable roof forms on the north facade. The second is to consider refining the second story addition, the portion that cantilevers at the rear of the home, to consider modifying the column proportions at the rear porch to look more proportionate with the second story projection and that bay window projection. Additionally, one could reduce the number of windows on the south elevation to improve the language and pattern and have it a little more consistent. And lastly, additional landscaping improvements to complement the proposed home could help the project achieve a greater exceptional design per the residential design guidelines. Parking. There is a existing 420 square foot two-car detached garage structure at the rear of the property, and that's proposed to remain. Additional off-street parking can be accommodated on the existing driveway. No additional off-street parking requirements are triggered with this project scope. Staff has not received any correspondences in regard to the project proposal. The project is categorically exempt from CEQA. And recommendation, staff recommends that the Planning and Zoning Commission review and provide feedback to the applicant and staff. This is a study session and no action will be taken tonight. And with that, staff is happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
With that, we will, are there any, before we start, are there any questions of staff before we turn it over to the sponsor's presentation?
I don't know whether it's a question of staff or when a question when the architect comes up, but I guess I'll ask. It's kind of a staff here. I noticed that you show the existing backyard as being 1.9 feet deep, which is the distance between the property line and that existing shed. And it raised the question to me that the house itself is many feet, a long distance away from the rear property line. Maybe 35 feet, I didn't add it up, but quite a distance. So the question to me is kind of what do you consider the back? Where do we consider the backyard in a situation like this where we have so many, we have 2 accessory buildings and decks and very little landscaping back there?
We measure from the farthest point of the rear wall of the main dwelling
Of the main dwelling, yeah.
to the
yeah.
rear yard, and then multiply that setback distance by the
Yeah.
property width.
So in the staff report, that the 1.9 feet is probably, that's 1 foot 9 inches. That's probably not,
That may be for the
that's for the
garage.
one building, the garage, yeah. The requirement is 20 feet, but they have way more than 20 feet to the back of the existing building, so. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought it was. You know, what's the rear yard, and what do we consider the rear yard? Yeah, okay,
There aren't
So-
any.
that's it.
Great. No other questions? Then we'll turn it over to the project sponsor to go ahead and give us a presentation.
Good evening. My name is Tom Chan, the project architect for 1036 Ramona Avenue. As you can see, the existing house is very small, which is built in 1928, nearly 100 years old. And at that time, this house was very small. I think is the character of those houses all in Albany right now, and it's being outdated. And over the years, it has been some addition, but it was not done right. So what we propose to do is to completely renovate this house and modernize it and bring it up to code today, and also improve the livability of the family, for the family, which has senior parents and then 2 young children. So that's why we need to have 4 bedrooms. It's going to be all on the upper level for sleeping. And then for the ground level, it would be for family activities, living room, dining, kitchen, and then with some outdoor connections to the porch and the deck at the back. And we also propose to have a vegetable garden in between the shed and the deck, so that the senior parents can do some outdoor chore there. And the front, we also look at the neighborhood pattern, with a proposed porch to be at the front to provide some welcoming sense to the house. So architecturally, we try to maintain the character of the house. So with the gable roof and the vent and the bay window, I think that is also a strong character of the house. I think the staff has some good recommendations for improvement, like the gables on both sides. The purpose for that is to minimize the bulk and mass facing the next door neighbors. That's the purpose, and also reduce the mass of the gables. If we don't have that, and then the gable will reach a higher elevation. So that is, and I think some refinement, if we are proposed to, probably we will change some of the shape of those gables, maybe combine them. It is challenging. I haven't come up to a good solution for it yet. But in my idea, originally, I think since those two side elevations, you won't really see from the street, but you will see the rhythm, rather than you will see it at the right angle. So you see it from the sideway, so you create some kind of rhythm, pattern, and then shade and shadow. So it's quite interesting too. So that is my original idea for that. So, but the staff has that recommendation. We would be happy to try to see if anything could be better. And for landscaping, it is a flat lot. So the front we want to maintain as open, facing the street, because it is BC triangular area. So we want to make it a sense of enclosure, a sense of boundaries with some hedges, planting along the front street. And then the front yard would be bay-friendly planting. So it's water conservative and then also easy to maintain. So that is something. We are not going to make a very lavish garden there. So that's why we don't have presented more detailed landscaping, but we have some intention for that. For quality of material, we are going to use aluminum clapboard windows, which will be more sound isolated because of the BC intersection. For the facade, we are going to use 2-width cement boards, so to provide some inches to the house. So upper part will be 4-inch, so it's more dense pattern, and then the lower part will be 8 inches. So provide some contrast with some treatments, so it will be a nice detailed architecture. The entrance porch, and we will also have some details at the top of the entrance too, with the edges numbers there, and then it will be a quite charming entrance porch. So overall, I open to commissioners' recommendation and suggestions. We are committed to make this a good project in Albany. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll now open it up for public comment. Is there anyone here who'd like to?
We have a couple of questions of him.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
sure. Sir,
Could you come back? A couple of questions. Let's see here. I do have a couple of questions. On the plans, and it may be because I'm not reading them correctly, but on the south side, there's a gate shown.
Yes.
And on the elevations, it looks very dominant. When you look at the house, there's an existing gate that's kind of set way back. It's a wooden gate like that. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was what was going to stay there. It was going to be retained. But on one of the plans, it says gate to be removed. So you explain a little bit about what you're thinking of there on that gate that's in the driveway. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. The reason we said that the gate will be removed is actually we mean is replaced, because it was a bit old one, and then,
Okay.
yeah.
So
we
you're
want to update.
Update it
Yeah,
and replace
update
it. Okay, that's good. That answers that.
Mm-hmm.
The existing house has a lot of, so it looks like wood siding.
Yes.
And so you're going to basically re-side the entire house then? All the old siding will come off and
Yes, the reason for
re-side
that.
it, but again, with similar lap boards, but there'll be a hardy board or asbestos concrete or something like that.
Right.
I see. Okay.
So, yeah, we have done some hardy board projects both in Albany and Berkeley and other cities. And hardy board, it is getting more and more popular because it's fireproof, and then also, probably,
No, it's pretty common, yeah, I agree. I agree with that. Okay. Let's see if I had another question. I thought you did a great job with your story poles, by the way, except you left off the north side where all the gables are going to be the most dramatic part of the building. You didn't do, but anyway, the rest of it, they're a very good story
it's
poles.
very challenging, like a model building.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. For the moment, I think that's all that I have. Yeah, okay.
any other questions?
I have a couple questions.
Sure, Commissioner Kent.
So you're putting a fireplace in? Is that a gas fireplace or?
Yes.
Okay. Also, back to the planting, I think maybe it's just the wording, but, hedges are not part of bay-friendly, right? Because hedges require pruning and maintenance, and bay-friendly is like a low-maintenance landscape idea, so you don't use a lot of electric or gas-powered machines to maintain the property. So you can still have your hedge, but we call it a screening. It's just the shrubs. Make sure you use shrubs that don't have to be clipped every few weeks.
Right. The hedge, we are using those glass, the tall glass ones, the green with the evergreen. So you don't really need to trim it very often.
Right, okay, that's.
On the right-hand side, I would suggest them to have evergreen, taller hedges between the neighbors to provide some separation.
Yeah, so the screening, so you just want to stop using the word hedge, but I think I get what you're saying. So you want a screening, which works right, you get this, I think that's, I just wait to see it developed a bit.
Right.
And then for the front, you have a very kind of formal arrangement of those edge shrubs, and then the interior is lawn or grass?
No, those would be some kind of strategically located drought-resisting plants.
Okay, so I'll wait
Some
to see it develop, but I just wanted to make sure that.
Probably we will provide some reference pictures. next
Yeah, I trust that it's going to be developed, just that some of the language is conflicting with what you're saying,
Right.
that's all.
Right, right.
Yeah, I like the building, it looks quite nice.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
With that, we'll go ahead and open it up for public comment. Are there any speakers who would,
I do have a speaker
cards?
card.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Jerry Holland.
Hello, it's nice to see everybody again. I'd like to say this, I'm glad the story polls were up because this is what grabbed me. This has been one of my favorite cottages in Albany ever since I moved here. And I saw the story polls and I was like, oh my God, what's going on? So I sent Chris an email and, found out that it was on the agenda tonight. So I haven't really studied this at too length. But mainly, I think I appreciate all the gestures you've done and I appreciate the small lots and trying to, make these small houses, have some volume and some mass. But I think the thing I want to say the most is that I think what we're losing here is the most charming front single-story facade that we have of that era. It's a 1928 building. It's probably a late Victorian, and the facade's more Victorian than anything else. And we have very few of these buildings in Albany. And I think that the two-story front facade, the way he's designed it, would be fine if it was in San Francisco where there were a lot larger ones or there were a lot more Victorians in Albany, but we don't have that many. And I think the two-story front facade destroys the original charming one-story front elevation, which I think is almost perfect in its proportions. And I think what I'd recommend without too much thought is just moving the second story back a few feet and preserving that little single story front. That's the original, the home there. And I also think we're losing those beautiful, divided light original windows with that arts and crafts division. I think those, at least in the bay, should be preserved. I think this conforms to the front setback, but if you put a 20-foot front setback on the second-story addition, it would solve some of these issues. I do appreciate bringing the front porch forward. That was a good gesture. But I think, to stay consistent with the architectural style and, going back to that high-quality architecture that you need here for a 55% floor area ratio, we're not getting it here, not with wood, not with hardy siding. I appreciate the practicality of that, but I think at least on the front facade, we should maintain a real wood facade and real wood windows. I think aluminum-clad windows on a wood building are horrible, and I think by the time these materials are put in place on this massive house, it'll look very artificial. I think when you have a historic home, you should try to respect the character there. And I think if you are going to do two types of siding, which I think is a good idea, you should keep the original siding on the single story and the second story have the different siding. So I think what I'm here to say is that I think we really just, if we do anything here, is just preserve the character, the materials, and the charm of the original first story front bay. I think that would be a really critical thing for Albany to at least be able to see what this house was, because the way this thing is going to get built, you'll never ever have any idea what this thing originally looked like. On the side elevations, and I appreciate that you won't really see them too much from the street. The south side is too busy for one cottage. I think one simple gable would be enough, and I think the north side is way too busy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Do we have any other speakers for public comment? Great. Seeing none, public comment is closed, and we'll turn it back to the commission for discussion.
Could I just ask one clarifying question, maybe that the architect can address? So I assume that what you're planning to do is lift the house up and build under it, right? So this idea about preserve what's on the second story and then add something different on top doesn't fit. That doesn't fit with your plans, right? Or am I?
Originally, we tried to lift it up and then do that, but
Oh, that's not what you're doing.
no.
Oh, okay.
Right. So we are going to preserve the floor. The floor
Okay.
and the lower part.
Okay, so you really are building on top
yeah,
and not just lifting it up. Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have other comments? Okay. Well, I do have a couple of comments if I can sort of jump in here first, if that's okay. I actually do agree with a good number of the comments that the speaker, Jerry, just had on this. I similarly, I really appreciate a lot of the efforts and the sort of vision that the architect just described. I personally don't feel, though, that the proposed project does respect the existing architecture of the building. If this was a vacant lot, I think I would be having a very different conversation right now. But I do agree that this is sort of part of Albany's older housing stock. It's sort of pre-McGregor architecture, and we don't have a whole lot of them left, let alone ones that are still quite well preserved on the exterior. You know, and I did see some of the interior photos from the sale that occurred in January, and I certainly, this home needs some love. And so I do very much also value and appreciate that maintaining older homes and taking the risk of buying them is a big investment. They need a lot of work, and we need somebody who's willing to put some money in it to extend the life further. So I understand that there's a little bit of balance there in terms of conferring some value and putting a lot of money into a building. With that said, I do think that the front of the building, the volume of that one-story volume really should be preserved. And I think the right, sort of the sweet spot for where the second story should begin is somewhere around the existing cross gable, or effectively a cross gable of where the building is. I think that's sort of a natural transition to sort of hip it in or do some sort of gabled addition. And I think on that addition, I agree, the differentiated materials, I have no problem. I appreciate the use of aluminum clad wood windows. I think generally, again, on a non, typically, I'm very supportive of the use of that material, absolutely supportive of it for the addition. The hardy siding on the addition, again, if it's a smooth finish rather than the textured, I think that's fine. I understand the fire significance, but I do think on this front portion, there is actually something worthwhile about maintaining the wood material and the wood windows with the true divided lights. If those are failing beyond repair, I think replacing them at least with sort of that architectural quality 3D mutton in the same pattern is really critical. So in terms of the volume, that's my feeling. I do think the existing dormers are way too busy. I think that'll all get changed if you do set back the vertical addition to begin around the cross gable. So I'm not going to sort of get into nitpicking all of those details, but I think generally speaking, volumetrically, this block does have, especially right in this part of this block, there's a very different sort of character and scale that's going on here. These homes are really set back from the street. They are pretty narrow at the street. They've got a lot of space between the buildings, and this is one of the parts of Albany where you do actually see a series of one-story buildings. And I think, again, there's something about that character that when it does exist, I think there is something worthwhile for us to sort of keep that nod to our history here in San Francisco. The windows, again, I'm a little, the primary facade is really where I think my main focus is, and I'm willing to be more flexible on the secondary facades. I do think there should be a vision for the window pattern that's being selected, whether that's, you know, again, past that sort of return of the original building, whether that's all casements throughout or all double hungs throughout. I think so long as there's sort of a vision, I'm flexible on that. The rear cantilever was a little odd to me, but again, I'll put my critique mostly sort of on that front part, because I think if we can get that part, I'm a little more flexible on some of the other aspects of it. I think my last comment here is just lastly on the window detail on the proposed. I know it did note aluminum clad wood windows. I would just note that the section didn't really appear to depict what a typical aluminum clad wood window set back 2 inches from the facade would look like. It looked like you were counting applied trim as part of that 2-inch reveal, and I think the 2-inch reveal is really intended to be from the face of the building, not from the face of the trim. So just a couple of things to keep a sort of note of as you look at redesigning is to make sure we really get that shadow for the proposed windows in the new building, using those high quality materials, and then really just setting back that volume. So those are my list of items that I would just provide as feedback. But again, I do, I know that's a little bit of a list, but I do, again, I'm really happy to see somebody being willing to reinvest in this home. And I'm really hopeful that with some of those additions, I would even be supportive of you going back deeper. I do think there is a little bit more buildable area to the rear of where you are right now to sort of offset maybe some of that volume that you're losing at the front. I understand and appreciate sort of the multi-generational family that you're trying to move in here and rehabbing it. So there might be some trade-offs that we as a commission can take a look at. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's see.
Commissioner Donaldson, did you have?
Yeah. When I went out in the field and everything, I really hadn't, I was impressed by the charm of the existing building. I really hadn't thought of it from sort of an historic architecture perspective at all when I went out there. And I looked at your plans, and I liked a lot of what you were doing with the front facade. I liked the fact that you were going to be moving the door up closer to the street, and I liked the idea that you were going to preserve the vent and the roof pitch at the second level. Jerry Holan's comments about saying, well, this really might be, this is an historic asset, sort of changes my way of looking at the building and at the entire building, and one that I kind of missed when I first went out there. So I hear her comments, and I like a lot of what Elizabeth has been saying too, and that is let's try to preserve the very front part of that building, pretty much the way it is. Even though we would and bring the entrance closer to the front. So I think that's great. I think that would be very good, and it is a really charming cottage-like thing. So if we do that, then how do we expand it and sort of come close to meeting your program, your architectural program, for a lot more space and for more bedrooms? I'm not too excited about the cantilever in the back, so I think that you could push out the back and gain space in the rear there, and then move or shorten your proposed second floor, make it shorter. And thereby go back and have the second story addition set back from the street, so that that existing front facade of the building would be preserved and would really stand out well. I am bothered by the four roof pitches on the north side. It just doesn't look right to me, and I think they are visible from Pomona Avenue as you come down Pomona Avenue, given the existence of the very low house in the front and its driveway and the angle of the street. They really are going to be very visible, and the fact that they were missing in the story pole looked to me like, oh boy, I wonder what the neighbors would think if they saw those four pitches there. I hear what you're saying about those providing dips and gaps that will reduce the shading on that side. And I don't know quite what the solution is. You're dealing with a narrow lot, and a very steep roof pitch. So if you continued that pitch and didn't have those gables, you wouldn't have enough ceiling in your row of bathrooms there. I understand that. But I really think it needs some more work to figure out how you can do that and have. I don't know where the cut point would be. I don't know where the minimum height of the north wall of those bathrooms along the north side would be, but I think it's a real architectural conundrum that you're in there. maybe having those gables is the right solution. But in the elevations that we have right now, they look really dramatic, and actually on both sides. Maybe if we had a 3D elevation and we could see them in the context of the main roof gable, they wouldn't look so bad. I'm not sure, but I don't like them the way they are, the way they show on your plan, on your flat elevations. What else do I have to say? Let's see. I would love to see the wood siding preserved on the. I really like the idea of keeping that and keeping the front of the building with that original siding and preserving the original windows is good. Okay, let me see if I have some other notes here on my plans. That may be all my comments for right now. I think it is. Yeah, that's on that. I had a question about the gate. I already asked you. And I think when you come back with us, that we will want to see a landscape plan with more specific plantings on it, as Chris has alluded to as well. So, okay. I think that's all I have right now.
Commissioner Kent?
Eager to hear others say. Yeah.
I'll keep it simple again. Yeah, just to reiterate, next go around, since you're bumping up against the maximum density here, or FAR, a real landscape plan. I think you spoke to it. We just want to see it. And I was also struck by Jerry's comments. I hadn't really impressed upon me the historic significance. And maybe it's as simple as that bay window on the bedroom goes flat. And so the prominence of the bay window on the first floor is intact. It's not dissolved by going all the way up. And I also like the two siding idea. I think that's great. So you have the original siding and then the new siding. That's it.
Commissioner Jennings?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm kind of two minds about this historic element because I'm not really comfortable with, we don't have a historic preservation ordinance in Albany. I don't think there's any way for a homeowner who's not, an architect or a historic preservation expert to, when they're buying a house, to understand that there may be some kind of, they're not on notice, that there may be concerns about historic character of the house, and I don't really like the idea of making ad hoc decisions that this is a historic house that we can't touch. That said, I don't think anyone's quite saying that, but I don't really like that ad hoc nature of making those kinds of decisions. On the other hand, I think that just from a sheer design perspective, a lot of that resonates with me, and understanding that it's not your plan to lift the house up, and I think does create some opportunity to preserve some of those features on the front of the house, which is really cute. And I think if there is a way to keep those windows. So we're doing a house project right now, and I was surprised we had to replace all of our windows just for energy. We wanted to keep the historic windows on the side of our house, and we couldn't because of the energy calcs. So I don't even know, I don't know if that's a possibility, but the windows are beautiful, and if there is a way to keep those and maintain, just some of the design integrity of what's there, then, and I would be certainly comfortable approving something at this FAR that has the massing, pushed a little more toward the back. So I would encourage you as well to work with some of the concepts that others have talked about here, and that includes, trying to simplify the gabled roofs on the sides, and perhaps reducing some of the number of windows. Although I do appreciate that not very many people are going to be seeing it from that angle. And like Commissioner Waddy said, I think that if you're able to work with preserving some of the front existing design, I think there may be more flexibility on other sides of the house.
Are there any other comments of commissioners? Otherwise, I think that wraps up our feedback.
Can I look through the staff's points and just see if we've covered all those? I thought they were very good. The gable roof forms, we've talked about that. The cantilever at the rear, we've talked about that. The column proportions at the rear porch, I think that's a good comment, but that could change with the cantilever changing. The number of windows on the south elevation, and it could to improve the window language and the pattern. I agree with that comment. There are a lot of windows on the south side, and they're very much in a row. They may not all need to be all that big. I think you talked about it a little bit. Yeah, that's right. And the landscaping. So I think we've covered the staff's comments here too. So, okay, good. That's all.
You guys get everything you need as staff?
Yeah.
That closes that item, and now we will then move on to item 7 on the agenda, which is new business. Item 7-1, soft story ordinance study session.
Good luck.
Bear with me a moment. There we go. Thank you for your patience. Good evening. Jeff Bond, Community Development Director. What I'd like to do this evening is give you essentially a presentation that I gave the City Council a few months ago and bring you up to date on that, and then to get your feedback as we hopefully advance this program over the next few months. So all of you, I imagine, are quite familiar with the concept of soft story construction and the risks associated with that. I'll go through it just real quickly. In terms of where the city's coming from on this, the idea of addressing the risks associated with soft story construction has arisen most recently out of the City Council's strategic plan, which had a specific objective and strategy to work on an ordinance to address seismic safety. In addition, the city, all cities in California are required to prepare local hazard mitigation plans, and as a part of that, one of the recommended actions that was incorporated in that plan was to prepare a comprehensive soft story retrofit ordinance. So to begin with, just to give everyone a little bit of history, and a lot of this I should mention there were quite a number of attachments, sorry for loading you up on that, but the Association of Bay Area Governments has done quite a bit of work in recent years, and 2 of their documents were attached as part of your packet that goes into much more detail. So what I'm doing is really a very brief summary of the work that they've done. But to give you a little bit of background on building codes, the way building codes work is that today's building codes apply to today's construction, and they're not applied retroactively. So in other words, an older building that could be an obvious hazardous soft story is perfectly legal today in California, in most cities in California, unless you have a program like this. The building codes in general in California have evolved since most of the structures in Albany have been constructed up until the 1970s, and it was really the 1971 San Fernando Valley earthquake that really started to trigger new building codes in California that had some seismic engineering incorporated into them. And a series of earthquakes since then, the 1989 Loma Prieta, the 1993 in Northridge, the California earthquakes, but also the 1995 Kobe earthquake in Japan were particular events that led to significant changes in our building codes. And so every 3 years there's some changes, and we'll continue to see them. We haven't received our new codes yet for the next year, but I'm sure there'll be some changes in new codes that become effective in January. The most important part of that really is to realize that it only applies to new construction, not what we've got in the ground today. Now, with respect to the types of risks that we're dealing with, this again is probably familiar information to you, so I'll go through it real quickly. But the good news is, I don't want to scare everybody with these kinds of issues. Many of the homes in Albany, if they've been retrofitted and they're on a flat lot, are probably the best place to be in an earthquake in terms of a structure. Certainly new homes are in good shape. Anything built in the last 15 or 20 years has very good codes, and the things that you have in your shelves and hanging on the walls may crash down on you, but the building's going to be fine. Older buildings, however, are an issue. The soft story, the traditional soft story, and I have an image of that in a second, has the large openings on the ground floor. Unreinforced masonry buildings are sometimes the most dramatic images after an earthquake and can be the most deadly. And even buildings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, some of the taller commercial buildings that are either concrete frame or steel frame that were welded can be hazardous and can fail in either subtle ways or dramatic ways in an earthquake. Also, although not an issue just in Albany, in the Bay Area in general, many of the tilt-up industrial buildings, the older ones, can be an issue because the walls separate, basically peel back. It's like they deconstruct. They were constructed by tilting the walls up. In an earthquake, they untilt. With respect to any building that is irregularly shaped, if it's got lots of corners and slopes, odd slopes, can put concentrated loads on particular corners or parts of the building that may not be engineered to carry those loads. And then again, as I mentioned, none of these things really address the risk of hazards within the building that can come crashing down on you. Newer buildings are better about things like decks and chimneys. A lot of Albany buildings, I think when they were built, nobody even thought about looking at a deck. You look at them now today and you can't, they're frightening to think about. And the same goes for some of the chimneys. They're literally just bricks stacked up with some mortar and there's no reinforcement in them. So just briefly here, this is what happens in an earthquake to soft stories. The building on the left is kind of the more traditional San Francisco type of, or downtown Oakland type of soft story building. The building on the right is maybe a little bit more likely to be seen in Albany, but the outcome is kind of the same. The ground floor fails. The top two floors kind of hold together, but they're uninhabitable after that. And again, I'm not a big fan of showing gory pictures. And this is an example of a picture that's not so bad. Everybody, I'm sure, walked out of this building. Unfortunately, they're never going to get back in again. They might get their stuff out one at a time if the local authorities let them in. But this kind of thing can have dramatic impacts on the community. The kids that might be living in an apartment like this could, they're going to have to live someplace else. They may not be able to continue in Albany schools with their friends. Not to mention the impact on businesses not getting the revenues of shopping, the customers that are living here, city and school district losing revenues, and so on and so forth. And I'm not trying to, not my style to scare everybody, but it's a very serious consequence of the failure of a lot of these buildings. So what to do about it? Again, as part of the package of materials you received, there was some examples from Oakland and Berkeley and Alameda. Each of them are a little bit different, but the framework of what they're trying to do is essentially the same. I like the idea of using what neighboring cities are doing because we deal with a lot of the same architects and engineers and contractors. And so to be able to say, we're doing it just like Berkeley, we're doing it just like Oakland, or we're doing it kind of like that, just helps us in our communication with property owners or engineers or contractors. So what happens in these ordinances is the first 4 points here: adopt standard. It's not in our current building code, but we can look at what other cities are doing. One of the things that I would like to do at a future meeting is bring in a structural engineer that does a lot of work in retrofit ordinances, and he was one of the co-authors of the ABAG work, and he would be able to help the city with the technical engineering parts of this that none of us are qualified to be able to evaluate in any detail. The second thing that we would do is to make a preliminary determination of the risks associated with buildings. We've done that. A few years ago, an organization that I'm involved with did a survey of Albany, it's the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, and it was by no means a comprehensive survey, but we were able to identify 75 structures, or, roughly 75 structures that have soft story characteristics, and that was something like 500 units of potential housing at risk. And again, that was not a comprehensive survey. Those visual evaluations are pretty straightforward. It might want to have someone who has some familiarity with construction, whether they be architects, engineers, planners, contractors. The methodology is something that FEMA has prepared, and it's a score sheet. It's a 2-page score sheet with 8 or 9 pages of instructions that are pretty simple and straightforward. And in about 10 or 15 minutes, a person could fill this form out for a building and be able to, you reach a kind of a numerical conclusion using that score that, and if it's above a threshold, then it may have a hazard that needs further evaluation. So if we get to that point, we've done the preliminary survey and we think that there are some potential hazards, we would then require the property owner to retain a engineer for a full detailed structural evaluation. And if that engineer concludes that in fact there is a hazard, then there's some sort of noticing that goes on, whether in most cases I think it's some notice that goes on the building or to the tenants or something so that people know that there's a hazard there. In Alameda right now, their program stops there. They're just making the occupants and the owners aware of the hazard. In Oakland and Berkeley, they have a further step of requiring people to retrofit within a certain number of years. There are always in all these programs processes for people to appeal, and there should be processes for people to make a case for an exemption or hardship so that there's a little bit of flexibility in the program. But the main idea is with these programs is to require people to ultimately retrofit the building. And the argument I think that can be legitimately said is the order of magnitude of costs of retrofitting before an earthquake is way less than the cost of repairing after an earthquake. And if you assume we've got a pretty good chance of having an earthquake in our lifetimes, then you might as well just go do it now and save the money and the hassle, not to mention what the benefits to the community. This next 2 slides I can kind of toggle back and forth, just gives you an idea of the kinds of retrofits that you'd normally see in a soft story. This is an unretrofitted building, and this is various ways of retrofitting. This comes from Simpson Strong Tie, so it's they're kind of selling their particular product, which is fine. But there are other manufacturers of these kinds of things as well. But what you see in this on the screen is the big metal frame, moment frame around the garage door. That keeps the garage door, the opening from twisting around an earthquake. On the right-hand side of the screen there, that's this particular product is called Strong Wall. It's a shear wall. It's a specially engineered, relatively small but very strong structural element that keeps the wall from collapse. Oops, keeps the wall from collapsing. This is a more traditional kind of site-built plywood reinforcement to an otherwise unreinforced wall. And then there are all sorts of metal connectors and hold downs and so forth that go in all over the place to keep it all together, instead of, going back to this when things were just nailed together, and that was about it. And then all this needs a good foundation. It's not really shown on the screen here, but all of this needs to rest on a good solid foundation, which in some cases we don't have in some of the older buildings. This is not a straightforward, well, the repair work is relatively straightforward, but it creates some issues that should touch on. And the first is it does cost money to retrofit these buildings, and particularly in rental properties, there's a risk of that resulting in an increase in rental rates to the tenants. What we would propose is that our rent review program, which was a relatively new program here in Albany, be modified if necessary, but be used in some way to make sure that that impact on tenants is appropriate. In other cities, I think in Los Angeles, there are rent control, the others, Berkeley, Oakland, and Los Angeles, which have adopted programs like this, as well as West Hollywood and Santa Monica. I think all those cities have rent control programs, so there's a little bit more, in San Francisco, all these cities have rent control programs, which gives them a little bit more of, the government a little bit more control over what happens to tenants. And I think in Los Angeles, the policy trade-off landed at splitting the cost, amortizing the cost of the retrofit over time, and essentially passing half of it on to the tenant's rent. So if you need to do a retrofit, you're going to borrow money at a certain rate for a certain number of years, your monthly payment to the bank is going to be $1,000, and so you split that 50-50 with the tenants. There are a couple of other issues. There probably would be, to some degree, some disruption or displacement, a temporary displacement of tenants during construction. And then finally, again, it doesn't address everything. So you can have a perfectly good building and it survives the earthquake just fine, but there are other elements to the building or contents of the building that can create some serious issues. There are some specific, and I didn't really get into detail with this with the City Council, but I think there are some specific things that, more in the planning realm, that can help make this work better, or at least consider facilitating retrofit programs. The first is, if we're retrofitting soft-story buildings where the parking's on the ground floor in garages or tuck under in some way, and there are 1 or 2 or 3 levels of parking of residences above it, the retrofit program may result in, just because there's more space needed in the garage for structural columns or reinforcing the walls or something, may lose some parking spaces that would otherwise be required by the planning code. And so the first thing we might want to do is figure out a way of making waiver of those lost parking spaces acceptable. If you have a 10-unit building and they have 10 parking spaces, they may have to live with 8 or 9 in order to make room for the structural repair. And there are maybe certainly good arguments to be made for going forward with that. Even taking it a little bit further is the idea of maybe helping a property owner finance a retrofit by allowing them to convert, if it's feasible, otherwise feasible, convert some garage space into a micro unit. That gives them a little bit more, particularly if you're losing a parking space or two, maybe you can squeeze something in. And it gives them a little bit more cash flow to help pay the cost of the retrofit, and is another way for us to help broaden the portfolio of housing that we provide in the community. So it achieves multiple goals. There could be other development standards that we need to waive. If, let's say, a building is built right up to their setback line today, and the best solution is some sort of exterior treatment, it crosses that setback line. We honor that line strictly, and maybe in a case like this, it's reasonable to grant them an exception to that. And then there's the processing of applications. We're generally really good about processing applications quickly, and bringing them to you, but maybe in a retrofit case, we can consider even more expedient processing of these retrofit cases, these retrofit applications, just to eliminate the barriers and excuses that people will have for not doing it. These are all really kind of preliminary ideas, and I know other cities are kicking them around, particularly the micro-unit idea, I think, has been kicked around by a few other cities, but I don't know that it's ever been implemented. The final thing I wanted to do is just share with you a little, in summary, the feedback that came from the City Council when they discussed this. I think they were in general very favorable to the idea of pursuing something like this, and even talked about expanding the scope of it, which is great, although I'm not sure I want to do all of it all at once. But nonetheless, that was one of the comments they made. They also talked about outreach to property owners. I did attend I may get the name of the organization wrong, but the Albany Property Owners Association meeting recently, about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I think they were they generally get the idea of that this is something that they need to deal with. They talked about the importance of minimizing the cost to them of going through the program, so talking about fee waivers. In Berkeley, the City of Berkeley was successful in getting a substantial FEMA grant to help pay for some of the engineering much of the engineering assessments of individual buildings, and that's something that we would like to pursue. I don't know that FEMA's it was in the millions of dollars that Berkeley got. I don't know that FEMA's going to be doing that for every city in the Bay Area, but nonetheless, that's something we can pursue. Back to the City Council, they talked about, they mentioned the grant. The City Council also mentioned pursuing grant funding to help with this. And then one of the other things that came up, and is again something that we're looking at in a different context, is by eliminating natural gas in buildings, there's one less hazard that would be in the building in the event of an earthquake. And then finally, consider partnering with other cities for economies of scale. I haven't pursued this in any detail yet, although certainly the work that ABAG has done has been a big help so far, and we will look for opportunities to work with nearby cities that might be, share resources or technical studies or consultants or something like that. So that's my presentation. Be happy to answer any of your questions as best as I can. I'm a non-engineer, so don't ask me engineering questions. And then as far as next steps, I think we would like to continue to work with the commission and maybe start to dive into some of the details of these ordinances in other cities in future meetings, and hopefully get to the point where we've got, bless you, an outline of an ordinance that we have another study session with the City Council on. So, I'll pause here and wait for your questions or comments.
Any questions?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And we have a public hearing too, so we will. Well, Jeff's there. I'll ask some questions to see what order here. I do have. Yeah, I have. Thanks. I bet you didn't know that those attachments were 473 pages. I didn't read them all. It was a lot. Should. Anyway. I guess the first question I have is, what will be the role of planning and zoning on this, and does any ordinance have to initiate with us, or are you talking to us because we might see applications for retrofits, or you just want our commentary and input at this point?
A little bit of all of that. I think there will be some planning issues. If somebody were to come in today and do a retrofit and say, I'm going to have to take out a couple parking spaces to do this, you would see that application if there needed to be a modification to their conditions of approval from 50 years ago or whenever it was. And you might even be in a position of having to say, I'm sorry, we can't allow you to remove that parking space because, our standards are established at one parking space per unit or something like that. Or there's a setback issue. So there is, straight up planning issues. In addition, just to have a venue for community engagement on this. Obviously, there's Mr. Jordan's here, but and we didn't do a big push this evening to get in community engagement, but I'd like to, and I'd like to contact property owners. I'd like to contact other stakeholders and have a venue where some of those issues can be discussed, and it's not practical to do that at a city council level, so I think the Planning and Zoning Commission is probably the best place to do that.
Okay.
You're the
So we
most
might have a
familiar.
role then in developing the ordinance then. Okay, good, okay. And I think you hinted at it, but your timeline then?
It's a little bit of just balancing everything else that's going on. There's no firm mandate out there other than to get it done before the next earthquake.
And when's that going to be?
No, what?
I'm not telling.
Okay.
I'm not to take light of it, but it's, I would, this information is out there. ABAG has done tremendous work. I think every city in the Bay Area should try to make some progress in this issue sooner rather than later. I personally feel like it's a pretty high priority for me professionally. I feel like I have an obligation to the community for this. In terms of hazard mitigation for the city, I think this is a pretty high priority. So I would say I'd like to be back before you with some pieces of this every couple of months and get it done in the next year or so.
Okay, good. Unreinforced masonry buildings now, that's on a separate track, and does that relate to this in any way? And isn't that ahead of this? Is that right?
There was a separate track that I guess it was I'd have to go back and double check. I think it was in the 90s. There was a state law that required cities to do an inventory and to give notice to property owners to do URM retrofits. And that was a pretty successful program. There wasn't 100% compliance. I don't think there was a lot of teeth to that compliance. Most cities, I think, are getting, including Albany, got like 75% compliance. It could be folded into this. It's a different engineering problem.
Yeah.
And it's a different planning problem also because it's probably not affecting as many residences as it does commercial buildings.
Yeah, it's Solano, San Pablo, yeah.
Oh, primarily.
Fewer buildings, yeah. I know, it just came to my head when I was looking at this, yeah, okay. Is there any relationship between this and the earthquake insurance and the state earthquake insurance program? And related to that, if FEMA at the federal level is giving grants for this kind of hazard mitigation, is the state earthquake authority willing or able, or can they do that?
The California Earthquake Authority is doing a really good job with their Brace and Bolt program, where they're providing a grant to homeowners to retrofit homes. And we've gotten, I think, probably by now 85, 90 homes in Albany have qualified. It's kind of some sort of a lottery system. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but in terms of getting the money. But you can get this several $1,000s, I believe, from the state. So that's dealing with the single-family home problem pretty well. I don't know of any reliable funding source for subsidies to property owners or to cities for soft stories.
Okay. I don't know. That's all I have right now. I have a couple other comments from some more details. And other people have spoken or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Just one question. So obviously it'd be in the property owner's interest to fix the house or property so that it doesn't collapse and hurt people. And if they're a landlord, would there be a reverse incentive, such as if they knew that it was subpar construction, they didn't fix it, it collapsed, somebody was injured, could that person sue the landlord? Or was that, they could sue anybody, I'm sure, but, I mean, is that a resident?
I think there's probably the legal defense today would be, I didn't know, even though that's not a great defense. But by going through this process and at least putting a notice on somebody to say, you've got a potentially hazardous building, I think that changes that dynamic of disclosure a little bit. But I couldn't tell you as whether there's a particular liability exposure to a property owner or not. I don't know about that.
Okay, it seemed like there might be two incentives. One, you get low-cost loans. The other one is if you don't, you might lose your property.
Right, and the argument I've made to property owners that they tend to hear, I think, is, you've got an asset that in the Bay Area right now is extraordinarily valuable, and it's going to be destroyed if you don't do anything. Or not destroyed, but it's going to be significant. It's likely to be significantly damaged if you don't do anything, or possibly significantly damaged. So, don't make the investment to protect your asset.
Any questions?
I don't have any questions.
Okay. I just had a couple of quick questions. One, has there been any thought about developing some sort of like public financing option in Albany? I don't know if we have the sort of capital to do that. I know other jurisdictions do have that as an option for this, but
we haven't looked into that. I'd be happy to try to look into that. You're right. We have a modest scale municipal government, but it's something that we can see how other cities are doing, in particular smaller, mid and smaller size cities, if they figured out a way to break through that.
I think that was my only question I had for you. I have other comments, but we'll save that for later. Okay.
Sorry, I do actually have one question, so realizing that there are probably a million factors that can affect the cost of doing these kinds of retrofits, depending on the age and condition of the building and, site-specific characteristics. Is there any, do we have any data about, the order of magnitude we're talking about for a typical soft-story building in Albany? Is it, $10,000 a unit or $100,000 a unit, or, what's the range we're
There was someplace in one of the two ABAG documents, there was a
is that on page 472?
Yeah, probably.
Just kidding.
There was a cost estimate. It struck me as being quite low. The folks I've talked to about this, it's probably it almost doesn't matter what the number of units is. It's sort of whether it's 2 units or 5 units, you're doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. You're reinforcing the garage doors, or if there are no garage doors, you're reinforcing the columns that are holding the building up. And, there's probably in the $50,000 to $100,000 range.
The whole
Right, so you want to get
mm-hmm.
the 4 corners and a shear wall on each side, and it kind of doesn't matter how, within the range of this kinds of buildings that we have apartment buildings that we have in Albany, it's not a whole lot difference between 5 units or 8 units or 2 units.
Okay, great. Well, with that, we'll open it up for public comment. Looks like we have one
We
speaker.
do have one speaker card, Preston Jordan.
Thanks for saving me valuable time by announcing my name. So I am a certified engineering geologist in the state, so this is very close to my heart. I mapped the surface rupture of the Landers Fault earthquake, which is a 7.3 in 1992. And very different hazard than we have. Thankfully, we don't have that hazard, but mapped around homes that have basically been thrown up in the air and dropped back to the ground. So it was pretty dramatic. One of the questions, there's a list of good questions in the ordinance document, and I would suggest you might really want to focus on that one of all the ones, because it sort of has the menu of policy options. And one of the questions is, should this be mandatory? Should it be only evaluation? Should it be evaluation followed by mandatory retrofit? I would encourage you to recommend mandatory retrofit. I think that's where the council's headed anyway. ABAG, a little over a year ago, released a projection of housing loss by census tract in various earthquake scenarios. One was a 7.0 earthquake on the Hayward Fault, which is a full-length rupture. And it projected 1 out of 4 residences in Albany would be uninhabitable after that event.
How many?
1 in 4. So basically catastrophic for the community. A little more than half of that was due to the primary shaking, and the rest was due to the fires that follow that. So the buildings that are affected by fires are, they're going to be a total loss. At the same time, the Climate Action Committee, one of the 4 pillars of our Climate Action Adaptation Plan in development is a carbon neutral economy. And Albany doesn't have a lot of control on that, but you can certainly waste a lot of carbon by throwing away a quarter of your building stock. Building materials, or particularly concrete, are excessively carbon intensive. So there's a really strong nexus there. As far as some of the other questions, most of the cities look at 5 units and above. I don't know if that's appropriate for Albany. I would recommend that maybe Jeff could do some analysis, if you request it, of the sizes of buildings that look like they were soft stories in Albany. It might be that 4 units is a better cutoff for Albany, but we can base that on actual data. As far as rents going up potentially, unlike a lot of the other cities that have rent control, Albany does not have rent control, which means the rents are already market rate. And so in other cities that have rent control, they have a provision that the property owner can pass on reasonable costs for maintaining and upgrading the building to the rent. In Albany, the rents are already market rate. So it's really, can they feasibly increase the rent on this basis? It's a completely different economic situation. So it's not clear that they could raise the rent, which has some pros and cons. On the other hand, because the rents are market rate, the value of the properties here for any property owner that's owned the property for 3 or 4 years has gone up dramatically. And so they have the equity that they can borrow against to get this done. I can keep going or I can stop. It's up to you.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay.
Take up a couple more minutes.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I appreciate that. I've obviously been processing on this a long time. I didn't read all 472 pages, but I tried to read most of them. And I got a head start last year, so I cheated a little bit. There's also the question of what the cutoff date is for the code that the building was built to. A lot of cities say built after 1978 or built before 1978. I'm not quite sure how they picked that date. The Kobe earthquake in 1995 had a dramatic impact on the building codes. So I think at that time, California was using the Uniform Building Code. And at least for smaller wood frame buildings, the design was what's called a pseudostatic lateral force. So you basically imagine a giant pushing against the building, continuous push. And that was calibrated to the kinds of dynamic loading that the building would experience. And in the code before the Kobe earthquake results hit, it was about 14% of a force of gravity applied laterally. And afterwards, it was about 33% because of the lessons learned in the Kobe earthquake. So it was a huge change in the code, much more dramatic than I would imagine anything that happened in 1978, although I don't know the history. I tried to find out the history doing some searches tonight, but I couldn't find it. I don't know, again, you could go back to the inventory. I don't know when buildings were built in Albany. I've been here since '94. Not a lot of buildings have been built in that time, so maybe '78 is fine because there basically hasn't been any construction since then because of the 2 off-street parking space ordinance that went into effect. But that'd be another thing I would suggest you could look at from a data-driven perspective. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your forbearance.
Thank you. All right, seeing that we have no other speakers, public comment is closed, and we'll turn it back for commissioner comments.
Okay. Okay.
Commissioner Donaldson?
I had a couple more thoughts. I also think that for Albany, a 4-unit, not a 5-unit cutoff would be appropriate. I think that there are a lot of 4-unit buildings that were built in the 60s that in Albany. I bet there's more than a dozen of them that would qualify here. Built in the 60s and early 70s that have pipe supports or open garages underneath that should fall under this. That was when I was looking at the other ordinances, I jumped out at me. I think 4 is a better number for Albany than 5. Of all the different options, I think it was in the ABAG model ordinance that, you just do screening like Alameda did, or you do screening and then retrofit. I think for Albany, of all those choices, I'd say retrofit without screening. I think we've kind of done our screening. Let's just move into an ordinance that starts the retrofit process and save a year or two of the screening process, I think. So there was reference to the PACE project, and now I don't remember what it stands for. It was talked about, I think, in the ABAG report. And I'm wondering about it. Is it good? Is it a good program? And if so, can that help us? That's just my note. I don't remember much about it now. But anyway, I just had that thought. I wanted to find out more about it is what I'm saying, I think. And that's it. Yeah.
Have you want to go? I've got go ahead, Commissioner Kent.
Just a couple comments. They have the earthquake zones of Albany where some areas are more prone to liquefaction than others. I live on the hill, and when I bought it, the real estate agent said, "Oh, this is perfect and earthquake-proof." Well, that's baloney. I've since learned it's actually in a red zone. It's worse than liquefaction because it's halfway down the hill where all the traditionally all the rubble was. So it's kind of halfway on that and halfway on the rock. But those above me are actually in pretty safe, according to the earthquake zones. And there are quite a few new homes because that was all developed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So there are, I think, quite a few homes that are only maybe, I don't think there's maybe only a few that are apartment buildings, but most of them are just large garages with the houses on top. So I don't know if we nuance it for the zone they're in, or maybe that's just getting too complex. But other than that, I think we really should push forward. And I think the fact that as was mentioned that a lot of these rentals are market rate, there's really no reason someone paying top dollar for a very expensive apartment shouldn't get a safe one. And so I think it's really incumbent on the landlord to make the improvements if possible.
I'm glad we're talking about this. I'm glad you're pushing it forward and that the council has been talking about it. I think this was really informative, and I appreciate the thoughtful approach that you're taking. And I think, it is very important that there are both carrots and sticks, I think, to help get these buildings up to, to current standards. And so I think I would also support moving in a mandatory retrofit direction. Maybe that has some component of phasing in, based on the highest priority, the largest buildings or the oldest buildings or whatever the appropriate criteria are, or, perhaps if it's going to take some time to get a mandatory retrofit program in place that actually has legs, then perhaps there's a way to phase in an assessment and notice program first. I don't think the goal is to create extra work, but I think it's worth considering. How can you do the soonest to help inform people of what the risks are and help start moving them in the right direction. And in terms of what the ultimate program would look like, I think that for health and safety issues like this, it's totally appropriate to consider ways to streamline the process as much as possible. I'm not talking about getting rid of zoning standards or discretionary review entirely, but I think, perhaps granting some forms of blanket waivers or exemptions around things like parking or, lot coverage or whatever it is that that could be implicated in these kinds of programs. Because I think we want to put as few roadblocks in people's way as possible if we're going to be telling landlords that they need to make this happen. So I think, I don't want to review if there are going to be 20 projects that need to remove a parking space in order to get this approved, I don't think we should be making one-off decisions on those. I think we should seriously consider just making a policy decision around it, and making it a little bit easier on individual property owners, as well as trying to find ways to keep the permitting fees down or spreading the costs around, because I do think it's kind of it's sort of a community problem in some ways, and perhaps there are owners who have benefited from the economics of not having done this work already, and there may be arguments for just completely loading the costs on them. But I think it's worth considering whether there are ways to just to remove disincentives to getting with the program and reducing the chances that people will apply for hardship waivers and that kind of thing. And it's an interesting point about it being market rate housing, and so there may be limited ability to pass on the costs to tenants in any case. But I think that a lot of the units that are in soft story buildings in Albany are probably in the more the naturally affordable category, I would assume. I think we want to be mindful about any ripple effects that may have. So I don't know. I guess my bottom line is I think there are lots of things to think about, and I don't have a lot of strong views about where exactly things should go. But let's, I support getting it done and trying to create a program that will actually be implemented as soon as possible.
I agree with Megan's comment, particularly about the rental levels. I think Preston's approach to that is a little simplistic, and that we need a more nuanced approach. It'd be great if you can find a city that has one of these ordinances that is a non-rent control city, just to see how they've done it, because not everybody, not all the apartments in Albany charge market rate. There's a lot of them that are way below that, and it'd be unfortunate if this were an excuse for landlords to say, well, now I can go up to market rate rent, and when they've been real low. I don't know how it would be done, but I would hope that maybe the ordinance would allow them to amortize over a period of time. 20 years was used in the ABAG one, so that those retrofit costs just wouldn't be lumped on top of tenants immediately. So. And I also don't think that the Planning and Zoning Commission would get very few zoning applications that relate to the retrofit project. I don't think it's would add to our workload. I think that most everybody would be able to do it without having to come and get a permit for a parking exception or something like that. Turn that over on the other side. It might be you might want to think about the idea of some bonus units that then would require P&Z approval for someone when they retrofit. Maybe they get an extra unit. If their retrofit is, they might have a right to add to their building to get an extra rental unit if their retrofit is over, say, $150,000 or something like that. I don't know. But it's just a thought on that. Then, of course, that would come through the P&Z process. But, and I don't know if anyone's done that. But the sample ordinances you looked at are all rent control cities. And it'd be really nice if you could find someone who's a non-rent control city that's trying to do this and talk to them about how they're doing it as far as passing the costs on.
It looks like you wanted to say something.
Sure, go ahead. And-
Sorry,
Oh, that's okay. I'll say my comments afterwards.
Okay.
I just wanted to address the market rate, rental rates question, because it did come up in discussion with landlords. And there is some nuance to it. What I heard from the landlord association is that when a unit is vacant and they're out to market to rent the unit,
Right.
yes, they typically go to whatever market is.
Right.
Once they get a tenant in, particularly a good tenant in, they often don't increase the rents at rates that market is going at. So over time, you've got a good tenant, you're happy, they're taking care of the place, you're not cranking up the rent on them. And then something like this comes along, and then you feel like, well, I do need to increase the rent because I've got this new bank loan I got to pay off.
Right.
And so that's the issue, that there is a difference between, in many cases, and again, I'm conveying what I've heard from the landlords, is that not every unit is rented at market rate every day. The second thing that they mentioned with respect to that will just have to be thought through in terms of financing is that for units that have recently been purchased by a new landlord, they're probably tapped out in terms of their debt capacity. And how they're going to implement something and add another 50 or 100,000 or whatever the number is to their already tapped out loan is kind of an open question. The PACE program that you referred to, it's I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's basically a property tax-based loan. So the borrower doesn't really pledge in the sense of a normal loan, you're promising to pay property taxes. You're not promising to pay the bank with a traditional deed of trust. The problem with PACE programs is they're kind of borderline predatory financing. They're very high interest rates, and although it's gotten a lot better, they were abused early on by a lot of people who were, because it's easy to get them, and so somebody would be sold on a bathroom remodel or a kitchen remodel, and then some unscrupulous contractors are taking advantage of that, jacking up the rates and say, oh, no problem, I got this PACE loan program right here, you just sign here and you can borrow another 50 grand. And there were some real issues with that. I think it's better, but still it's kind of the last thing you would go to before you hit your credit cards to finish paying off construction work. No.
Not good.
Not something we strongly encourage. Yeah, I think the interest rates are like 8 or 9 or 10% these days.
Really?
High.
Okay.
Well, I just had a couple additional, I think I agree with most of my fellow commissioners, and I agree that we should require retrofitting rather than just doing sort of a survey throughout the city. I do think the balance is just one of economics and financing and figuring out where that sweet spot is of, to your point, as a recent homeowner, not tapping out the recent homeowner who might not have access to additional capital, being sensitive to sort of the unintended consequences of could it lead to evictions or pricing out tenants who might be some of our lower income tenants, sort of balancing all of that, but still putting in a program that does advance our seismic retrofitted housing stock, I think is important. I think as developing the ordinance would be a really helpful tool for me is if we did have, a spreadsheet or something for starters of what that initial survey of the buildings we think are at risk, how many units those buildings have, the year of construction. And I think kind of having that combination might help us also be able to tackle, where do you get either where does the mandatory line in the sand get drawn, but also where do we get our biggest bang for our buck, and kind of looking at that. And I think to me, part of that where the commercial conversation comes in is we have a lot of mixed use buildings that, just doing a quick little Google Drive on Solano just now, it does look like we have a fair number of what look like soft story buildings that might have just like 1 or 2 units above. And again, those might be some of our more affordable by design type units. I would imagine they're likely probably rental apartments. So I would hate for us to sort of overlook that housing stock when there is housing there. It just happens to be sort of looked at as a commercial property in one of our commercial corridors. So in that context, I would want us to incorporate some of those. I also think what could be an interesting part of implementing this, and I think where Albany as a small town could actually kind of go above and beyond a little bit, some of these bigger cities, is I think one of the impediments to doing this kind of work is just sort of the intimidation factor of doing construction. And I think to a lot of people who haven't remodeled their homes, the idea of like, where do I start? Like, how do I find a contractor? How do I know they're good? How do I know they're actually like not selling me a bill of goods? How do I get permits? Like, it's just a very daunting process. So, I think if the city could even offer like, hey, you can get like a free 1 hour meet and greet with a city staffer who will kind of walk you through from kind of your own responsibility as a property owner of like, you need to first hire a contractor. These are the questions you should ask. This is, like kind of hand-holding people through the process, I think would actually be a really great resource that we can uniquely offer, I think, in Albany. And then similarly, I think things like permit fee waivers, I think would also be really helpful. And again, maybe there's a line in the sand that gets drawn based on need or most at-risk buildings. I mean, again, there are plenty of property owners in Albany who have plenty of capacity to pay, and I think we do need to hit a sweet spot of where we're, what carrots we're offering whom and where it's really need-based. And so I think, and I don't know what that sweet spot is right now, but I do think on the sort of regulatory side, I think there are plenty of carrots that we can offer. And I think it is great to leverage sort of the power of zoning as a carrot for a lot of this effort. I think ADUs or increased density, whatever combination or even a combination of the two would be great, especially in these larger apartment buildings. I don't know if some of these buildings are already over density, so as part of that spreadsheet, it might even be interesting to see where they are vis-a-vis current density controls. But I know in San Francisco, that's been an incredibly successful program of allowing accessory dwelling units at an unlimited density when it's in conjunction with a full seismic retrofit. We may not want to take it to that full extent of completely eliminating all of the parking, but I think looking at what the right solution is in Albany, where we can offer sort of density that others wouldn't maybe get, I think is a great idea. And I think where we could come into is there will probably be some instances where FAR exceedances are occurring as a result of that, where maybe there's some design implications of where there were garage doors and maybe there's no longer a garage door and maybe it's a little funky how the windows need to go in for a unit or things like that, where maybe we can be a little more lenient on that. Or open space, I think open space could be an issue that a lot of these come into, where if somebody puts in an extra unit, it's a fully maxed out lot with an apartment building, there may not be the open space requirement. So thinking through some of that, I think could be incentives. And I agree on the setbacks. I think I would be open to at least that flexibility. I would want to make sure that they've first tried to retrofit a building on the interior, because obviously that type of bracing and retrofitting isn't always the most attractive. So I would want somebody to have, exhausted options. But I think those are the types of things that are certainly within our purview as the Planning and Zoning Commission and are, again, balancing the community benefits of seismic safety against some of the other components of like setbacks and density and parking. I think we need to take a real look at sort of what some of those balanced priorities and how much we can get sort of a win-win across multiple priorities. So those are my thoughts. Commissioners have any other?
That's great.
No? Do you have any other questions for us?
Okay.
We're good? Okay, great. With that, sorry, let me go back to the agenda. That closes new business. With that, we're on to item 8, announcements, communication discussions.
I actually did want to make just one quick announcement. The appeal hearing for 1115 Nielsen is going before the City Council this Monday, July 1st, in case any commissioners would like to attend. That was the triplex. It's entirely up to the commission if you'd like to attend or provide any written comments. Certainly your record, the meeting minutes is all reflected in the council packet.
We approved it unanimously, is that
That's
right,
right.
Paul? Okay.
Okay, great. With that, next meeting is Wednesday, July 10th. And with that, we're adjourned.
Okay.
you.
Both items that night were appealed.
Is that right?
Yeah, there was the one with the zoning M3 lot down on Pierce Street, and then there was a Nielsen lot at both streets. Wasn't our best night. Maybe it was our best night.
Maybe it was our guest. I don't know. Zoning. lot on Pierce Street. Oh, the affordable housing.
Yeah, the Saha.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Still, I feel like I remember those hearings. What was the address again? 11 what?
I'm not surprised about that.
I feel like
One on Nielsen, I just don't get it.
Equal protection.